영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
The Prince and the Pauper. Chapter 1. Two Boys. Long, long ago, two boys were born on the same day in the same city. Tom Canty was born to a poor family who couldn't afford another child. Prince Edward was born to a royal family who welcomed the new heir to the throne. A dozen years later, both boys lived by the river. While Edward lived in a magnificent palace, Tom lived in a shabby room in a poor neighborhood. While Edward's father was King Henry, Tom's father was John Canty, a thief. John often made Tom and his sister Nancy beg for money. As Tom headed out to beg one January morning, he met Father Andrew. The priest had taught him how to read and write, as well as some Latin. But what Tom liked best were Father Andrew's tales of palaces and princes.
Do you have a story for me today, Father?
Tom asked.
Of course.
The priest said as they walked together.
Once upon a time, there was a prince named Richard.
Because of Father Andrew's wonderful stories, Tom sometimes pretended to be a prince. This amused his friends, but they also enjoyed his game, except when he made them the servants. All too soon, Tom and Father Andrew arrived at the priest's church.
We'll finish Prince Richard's story later.
Father Andrew said.
I can't wait!
Then Tom sighed.
It's time to ask strangers for money.
Tom hated begging, but his family needed the money. Most people ignored him, so he was surprised when someone tapped his shoulder later that day.
What's this? A prince begging?
Tom turned to find his best friend, Julian Witt, laughing.
You have mocked royalty and are sentenced to prison!
Tom joked. Then, in his regular voice, he added,
I need a break. Let's see if anybody wants to play by the river.
Julian turned pale.
The river?
Oh, sorry. I forgot about what happened to you there. We'll stay away from the water today.
The boys found their friends, and the afternoon passed quickly. Prince Tom pardoned Julian, gave orders to his army, and met with his royal advisors.
Your Highness, the sun is setting,
Julian said.
Oh no!
Tom gulped.
I have only one coin for my father.
For a moment, Tom thought about not going home, but he didn't want to miss supper. Reluctantly, he said goodbye and headed home.
Where have you been?
Tom's father yelled.
You'd better have lots of money.
People weren't in a generous mood.
Tom handed over his one coin.
A generous mood.
John Canty echoed Tom's words.
Where do you learn this stuff? Probably from that priest.
That reminded Tom of something.
I wonder if Father Andrew has any books about Prince Richard.
He thought.
Maybe I could...
Are you listening?
John shouted.
I said go to bed!
Oh, don't send him to bed without supper,
Tom's mother pleaded. Meanwhile, Nancy tried to stay out of her father's way.
Don't interfere!
John said to his wife.
To bed, Tom, now!
Tom went to a corner and untangled some old blankets. He made himself as comfortable as possible on the straw covering the wood floor. But for a long time, his hunger and his parents' arguing kept him awake.
Go to bed before I lose my temper.
He tried to distract himself.
How many princes has Father Andrew told me about?
Tom thought.
William, Richard, James.
Tom drifted off, thinking of a distant kingdom. In his dream, he was surrounded by lords and ladies, beautiful music, and delicious food. Everyone bowed to Prince Tom and obeyed his orders. The next morning, Tom awoke in the same filthy room on Offal Street. He was still hungry and still wearing his ragged clothes. Tom sighed with disappointment.
I'll only be a prince in my dreams.
He thought, slipping outside before anyone else woke up.
But maybe someday I'll meet a real one.
As Tom wandered along the river, he lost track of time and where he was. After a while, he came upon a magnificent building. Tom's eyes grew wide.
Could this be the king's palace?
He joined a few people waiting near a golden gate. Suddenly, a boy and a man appeared in the courtyard beyond the gate. Dressed in silk and velvet, the boy wore a sword at his hip. Tom heard the man call the boy, Your Highness.
A prince!
Tom rushed forward for a better look. Immediately, a guard grabbed Tom's hand and jerked him away.
Step back, you pauper!
The people laughed. But the prince ran to the gate and scolded the guard.
How dare you treat a poor boy like that? Open the gate at once and let him in!
The Prince and the Pauper. Chapter 2. Tom Meets a Prince.
You look hungry and tired.
The prince said to Tom.
Come with me.
Tom was stunned by what was happening. The prince led him through the palace until they came to the prince's room. While the prince ordered breakfast for his guest, Tom looked around.
Imagine sleeping in that big bed instead of on the floor.
Tom thought.
He has so many books and a suit of armor and... What's your name and where do you live?
The prince interrupted Tom's thoughts.
I'm Tom Canty from Offal Street. And who are you? Prince Edward. Prince Edward? You mean King Henry's son and heir?
The prince nodded, and Tom quickly bowed.
I'm sorry to hear that the king is ill. Everyone is talking about him. I fear that my father may die soon. Some people say he's cruel, but he has always treated me fairly.
The prince paused and smiled.
Though he does like to criticize me. My father is mean to everyone,
Tom said. Just then, Tom's meal arrived, and he dug in with both hands.
He has no table manners.
Prince Edward thought.
And yet, you speak as though you've had some education.
The prince said to Tom.
Yes, I can read and write, but I struggle with Latin. Latin is hard at first,
The prince said.
but enough about studying. Is it pleasant to live on Offal Street?
Tom thought about the poor families who crowded together in every house.
Sometimes it is, but not when we're hungry.
He gobbled up some ham and eggs.
I hope that doesn't happen too often. Do you have any friends? What do you like to do?
Tom swallowed some bread.
My friends and I are always racing to see who's the fastest. Oh, I'd like that.
The prince said.
People say I'm a good runner, but I don't have anyone to compete against. My only friends are my older sister, Princess Elizabeth, and my cousin, Lady Jane. What else do you do with your friends? In summer, we swim in the river. We shout and splash each other with water. Of course, that's after we've played in the mud and made mud pies. I'm not allowed to get wet outdoors.
The prince said sadly.
Then how do you get clean?
Tom asked.
I have many servants who help me bathe.
The prince sighed.
Your life sounds wonderful. If I could run barefoot in the mud, I'd give up my right to be king.
Tom was horrified.
You can't do that, sir. Besides, it's not all fun. On New Year's Day, my best friend Julian fell into the river and almost drowned. Luckily, a stranger saved him. I'm sorry to hear about Julian, but I wish I could play with your friends. And I wish I could be a prince, if only for one day. Would you really like that?
The prince asked. Tom nodded. Prince Edward grinned.
Then let's do it! We'll trade clothes for a while and then switch back before anyone finds out!
A few minutes later, the prince was wearing Tom's rags, and Tom was dressed in the prince's fine garments. The two boys stood side by side in front of a large mirror. They stared at each other, then at the mirror, then at each other again.
They look so much alike,
Edward whispered. Tom laughed nervously.
We do indeed, sir. Except...
Edward frowned, peering at Tom's hand.
You have a bruise where that guard grabbed your hand. It's nothing.
Tom hid his hand behind his back.
It was cruel!
The prince stamped his foot.
Now close your eyes. I need to put away something important before I leave.
Tom didn't peek. He imagined that Edward was hiding documents, or even jewels.
All done!
Edward said.
Don't move until I return to this room. That's a command.
Tom stood still while Edward rushed from the room and out to the courtyard.
Open this gate at once!
Edward shouted to the guard. The guard hurried to open the gate. But as Edward passed by, the guard knocked him to the ground.
You wretched pauper! Because of you, I got a scolding from Prince Edward!
Edward's face flushed with anger as he picked himself up.
I'm Prince Edward. When I return, you'll be locked up for hurting me and my friend.
The guard sneered and gave Edward a mock salute.
I salute your gracious highness. Now get out of here!
A few people were still waiting outside the gate, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. They laughed and shouted.
Make way for his royal highness!
They cried. The Prince and the Pauper, Chapter 3, Beyond the Palace Gate. As Edward walked away from the palace, people continued to laugh whenever he called himself a prince. He continued to shout at them for not recognizing him as the heir to the throne. At last, everyone got bored and ignored him. By this time, Edward's feet were sore, so he stopped to bathe them in a creek. Looking around, he recognized a nearby building. His father had turned it into a home for poor, abandoned children.
My father has been generous to the children,
Edward thought.
so I'll be treated kindly there.
He looked down at his ragged clothes, which belonged to Tom, and sighed.
Right now, I'm as poor as the children who live there.
Edward spotted a group of boys playing in a courtyard. They were all dressed alike in the school's uniform. The boys quickly gathered around Edward, who misinterpreted this as a sign of respect.
Good lads,
He said,
please tell whoever is in charge of this home that Prince Edward wishes to speak to him.
A loud shout went up, and the boys laughed at this stranger in rags.
And who are you, beggar?
Asked one boy, who seemed to be their leader.
The prince's messenger?
I am the prince! How dare you speak to me that way?
Edward was outraged because he was used to being obeyed, not insulted. His hand flew to his hip, but he found nothing there.
Did you see that?
Another boy asked.
He thought he had a sword just like a real prince.
The boys laughed again. Edward stood up tall.
You should be grateful that my father, the king, provides you with food and clothing. And you shouldn't be rude to me.
This made the boys laugh even louder.
You are correct, Your Royal Highness.
The first boy said.
Down on your knees, loyal subjects!
Snickering and poking each other, the boys dropped to their knees and bowed their heads. Tired of being mocked, Edward kicked at the nearest boy.
Take that!
He cried as he missed. The group's mood instantly changed to anger.
Throw him in the creek!
Someone called out. For a moment, Edward was stunned. These boys were going to toss him in the water. Then he turned and ran as fast as he could. He didn't dare look back until he was far away. When he did, the boys were nowhere to be seen.
It's a good thing I'm a fast runner.
Edward smiled in spite of himself.
I could probably beat Tom Canty and his friends.
For the rest of the day, Edward wandered the streets looking for Tom's house.
If I can find Offal Street, Tom's family will realize that I'm the prince.
He thought.
And they'll immediately take me back to the palace.
But as night fell, Edward was still out on the streets. He grew so tired and hungry that he could barely walk. He gave up asking for directions because everyone insulted him instead of helping him. After a while, he stopped being angry with the boys at the children's home.
Food and clothing are important, but they're not enough.
He thought.
When I'm king, those boys will have an education too. And hopefully, they'll learn to be kind.
Edward pressed on as it began to rain and the wind picked up. He drifted deeper into the maze of filthy streets where the poor lived. Suddenly, a man grabbed Edward by the back of his neck.
Got you!
He cried.
Out at this time of night, and I bet you don't have a penny to bring home. If that's not true, then my name's not John Canty, and I'll...
John Canty?
Edward twisted around to see the man's face.
Are you really John Canty? Then you must be his father. Take me back to the palace immediately.
His father? The palace? I don't know what you're talking about. But I do know that I'm your father, and you'll soon regret...
I can't stand this a minute longer!
Edward cried.
Take me back to my father, King Henry, and he'll make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. Believe me, I'm telling the truth. I am Prince Edward, the heir to the throne. I'm not Tom.
Confused, John stared at the boy.
I don't know what game you're playing, or if there's something wrong with your mind. But you're going home with me to Offal Street.
He grabbed Edward again.
Help me!
Edward cried as people passed by. But John was already dragging the frantic, struggling boy toward Offal Street. A few curious onlookers followed them, but no one tried to help poor Edward.